Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to all of you for joining Midwest Dairy today. I am Trish Scorpio, and I work with the Integrated Communications team here at Midwest Dairy, and we're really excited to have all of you on the line here today for the webinar. And just to give you a little bit of background about Midwest Dairy, we represent 8,000 dairy farm families to about 38 million consumers across 10 Midwestern states. So we have a pretty broad representation, and we work on behalf of dairy farmers to increase dairy sales, foster innovation, and inspire consumer confidence in dairy products and practices. So we're really pleased to be hosting today's webinar and sharing the latest emerging research on full-fat dairy foods and how these findings are really changing not only consumer behavior, but also fueling some interesting product innovation to meet this increasing consumer demand. So we're excited to hear from our speakers today. This is the fourth and final session in our year-long series of consumer confidence webinars that we've been hosting, and we thank you for joining us. So I thought I'd get right into introducing today's speakers because we have so much to cover. We want to make sure we have some time at the end for questions. So our first speaker today is Dr. Mickey Rubin, who is Vice President of Nutrition Research at the National Dairy Council. And Mickey oversees NDC's sponsorship of nutrition research that is really focused on aiming our enhancing our understanding of the health benefits of dairy foods. He's a member of the American Society of Nutrition, and he serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And he's held roles at Kraft Foods and Provident Clinical Research. And following Dr. Rubin will be Madeline Daly, who's Senior Vice President of Market and Consumer Insights for DMI. She's a deep understanding of consumer and product trends and marketplace dynamics, and she plays a really strategic role at DMI in scoping, synthesizing, and interpreting information that really is useful to drive those critical insights to grow dairy consumption. And prior to DMI, Madeline managed consumer research for Quaker's Captain Crunch and helped guide the development of a variety of new cereals. She's also worked in McKinsey and Company's research group, analyzing the competitive landscape of industries and underlying trends. So a tremendous amount of expertise here on our panel. And I'd like to now hand the webinar over to Dr. Rubin.
Thank you, Trish. Pleasure to be speaking to everybody today on this topic. It's honestly one of my favorite topics to talk about scientifically. It really is just fascinating what we're learning about. Just fat and saturated fat and dairy fat specifically, we've really come a long way scientifically. So if you start, next slide, please, Trish. So you can, just to start off the conversation, you really can tell a whole story by just looking at Time magazine covers. Going all the way back to 1961, that's a picture of Ansel Keys, who ran the 7-country study, which was the first study that gave an indication that maybe fat would be something that we don't want to eat, that maybe it raises cholesterol levels and increases risk for heart disease. And so that's where the low-fat diets really had its inception. But then you move on, and then research started, and then 1984, you look at the Time magazine article and you see, frowny face, don't eat your eggs. But then in the early 99, early 2000s, things start to take a turn, and now all of a sudden, eggs and cholesterol from eggs aren't so bad for you. In 2003, maybe it's carbohydrates that are really the dietary villain, and then 2014, now all of a sudden butter is getting not what we thought it was. So it really is interesting looking at the history of it. But if you can pass on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of these headlines, not just on Time magazine, are focusing on dairy foods and full-fat dairy foods. We've been hearing a lot about it. Is it time to favor full-fat dairy? Are they better full-fat dairy foods better for you after all? What we're going to try to do today is give a flavor of what's the real science behind these headlines. A lot of people have been hearing about it, but let's actually dive in and look at what the science has to say. Next slide. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about saturated fat. I'm not going to talk about dairy yet. We're going to get to that in a second, but if we just talk about saturated fat, the nutrients. I think what I will say is that the other types of fats, polyunsaturates and monounsaturates that come from vegetable and plant or olive oil sources, those I think have really come around. Those are really, I think you're seeing those not being lumped into low-fat diets anymore. We really are, a lot of people are encouraging the consumption of some of those unsaturated fats. So the tide has already turned there. where we're still showing, we'll say, emerging evidence and some debate is in the area of saturated fat. And what we're going to look at here, these next couple of slides, are what are called meta-analyses. And these meta-analyses are not just one study. Each meta-analysis takes multiple studies and combines them to make them very powerful. You see this first one here on the left, published in 2010. This is actually taking 21 studies of population cohorts and combining them, looking at almost 350,000 participants. And what they found here was that when you actually look at saturated fat consumed, and then you try to relate that to actual risk of heart disease, CHD or cardiovascular disease risk, there really is no association. There is no direct link between consuming saturated fat and cardiovascular disease risk. Same on the right, another analysis, very similar, this time a little more broad, include 32 studies, 500,000 participants. Same take-home message on saturated fats. There's really no evidence that saturated fats are associated with disease risk at all. Next slide, please. And then another one, this time in 2015, looking at up to 12 observational studies, depending on the outcome, up to 340,000 participants. Saturated fats are not associated with mortality, cardiovascular disease, heart disease, stroke, or type 2 diabetes. Now, when I say not associated, that just means neutral, not good, not bad, just neutral. It's not something to necessarily encourage or discourage. There's just no impact on disease risk from consuming these fats, according to these studies. But when we move on to the next study on the right, this is where we're starting to see that there might actually be something to consuming saturated fats, because this study, similar analysis, 15 prospective studies, almost 500,000 participants, and there was no association between saturated fats and cardiovascular disease, except they actually found a benefit here with saturated fat consumption and stroke risk. So this is really the first time we're starting to see, is there actually a benefit? And that we'll get to some deeper questions for that a little bit later on. And then the next slide, this is the latest and greatest of these observational population studies that just came out about a month or two ago. This is published in The Lancet, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. And it's a new cohort called the PURE study. It's looking at 135,000 people from different regions all across the world. It's meant to equally sample high, medium, and low socioeconomic status individuals. And again, with this latest and greatest findings, they found no association with saturated fat consumption and cardiovascular disease, risk of heart attack, MI, or CVD mortality. And again, they actually found the same association of a stroke benefit in this one. So clearly the story is evolving on saturated fat in general. We're starting, it appears to be neutral, if anything, and there's even some indication that might be something to it, at least in terms of stroke risk. So next slide, please. So let's dive down a little bit deeper. And now we're going to talk about dairy foods and dairy fat. Remember, dairy foods and full-fat dairy foods, they're a source of saturated fat. They're not the only saturated fat source in the diet. And saturated fats are about 2/3 of the fat in dairy, and the other 1/3 comes from polyunsaturates and monounsaturates. But let's look and see what the science on dairy says. This first meta-analysis, again, another one that combined several studies. This is looking at total dairy, so includes milk, includes cheese, includes yogurt consumption, and it includes full fat, low fat, medium, 2% fat. It includes all of those things. This is just total dairy and risk for cardiovascular disease. And we see, in general, very consistent relationship on the left, moving towards the left of that graph, showing that there's a decreased risk for CVD with total dairy consumption. You see about a 12% reduced risk overall. We look to the next slide, which is the same meta-analysis, this time for stroke. And again, we're seeing a benefit for total dairy consumption and risk of stroke, about 13% reduced risk overall. Again, total dairy. This is not just milk, this is not cheese, yogurt, this is everything combined. A lot of these observational studies, they're not able to necessarily differentiate individual foods, so they look at the total food group and the consumption of that food group and risk of disease. Next slide, please. Then we come to 2012, and I would say this is, I would say a landmark study in some regard. This is from a group who was at Tufts University, Darish Mozaffarian, who's published a lot in this area, looking at not just saturated fat consumption and cardiovascular disease risk, but what is the food source of that saturated fat, and does it make a difference? And what they found here is when they separated out food sources of saturated fat, what I'm showing here is, if you look at x-axis on the bottom there, is increases as we increase in dairy saturated fat, we have a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, actually showing a benefit by consuming dairy saturated fat on risk of cardiovascular disease. This is in the MESA study, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, which is a cohort here in the United States that includes multiple ethnic groups. In the same study, they actually found the opposite with saturated fat from meat sources. They used a combined meat sources from all different meats, and they showed that there was an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Here, dairy was the opposite. Dairy provided a benefit, which is really a landmark study, and it's really interesting to starting to see the separation in this new and emerging research. But again, this is dairy saturated fat. We're not really talking about a specific dairy food yet. So the question might remain is, well, what specific dairy foods? Is milk lumped into this, or what happens when you just look at cheese, or what happens when you just look at yogurt? So some studies have started to do that, and this next slide is one of those. Now, those previous studies that we looked at were observational in nature. There was no intervention. It was just following cohorts of thousands of people, assessing what they ate on their own, and then assessing disease risk. This study that I'm showing you here on this slide right now that you see is actually an intervention. And it's looking at cheese consumption and looking at 139 subjects. And this was a study that was sponsored by National Dairy Council and co-funded by some of our international colleagues at dairy councils from other countries. And it took place at University of Copenhagen. And what this study looked at was what happens when we take the 3 servings of dairy that are recommended, and 2 of those 3 servings full fat cheese. You see regular cheese there on the left, 80 grams per day. The middle condition was actually reduced fat cheese. Same idea, make 2 of the 3 servings reduced fat cheese, same amount of cheese. And then a control group that did not have a dairy intervention, that did not have a cheese intervention. And what they found was after 12 weeks, these people who every day for 12 weeks had 2 servings of full fat cheese, again, which is, not necessarily what's recommended in dietary guidelines, but to see what would happen if, this full fat, 2 servings of this full fat dairy food were consumed every day for 12 weeks. And what they found was there was no increase in total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, which is the quote unquote bad cholesterol, or HDL cholesterol. So the conclusion of these researchers was a high daily intake of regular fat cheese for 12 weeks did not alter LDL cholesterol levels or other risk factors associated with metabolic syndrome. This is the latest in a series of studies that we've seen come out on cheese, showing that cheese just does not seem to impact LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, as one would predict based on its saturated fat content. It's just there's something perhaps about the other nutrients that are coming along in cheese, whether it's the protein or the calcium or other micronutrients or the structure of cheese and the way the fat is delivered. It just does not seem to have the impact on LDL cholesterol the way one would predict from its saturated fat content. On the next slide, what happens when we look at cheese and disease risk from going back to those observational cohort studies? Well, again, the opposite of what you would predict based on our earlier understanding of saturated fat. We're seeing actually small but significant reductions in disease risk just from cheese consumption. These are studies that were able to differentiate cheese from other sources of dairy, other dairy foods in the diet, and they actually found a benefit. Perhaps this partly explains what we're seeing, what we saw in the previous slide, where there is no impact on cholesterol levels, but you are getting nutrients provided by cheese, contributing to an overall healthy diet. And as part of that, we are seeing reductions in disease risks, this cardiovascular disease, heart disease, and stroke. Interestingly, this paper was e-published last year and just got published in print this week. So this one that we're looking at right now is actually getting a lot of renewed media attention this week. So next slide, please. So we've talked about total dairy, and we've talked about specific dairy foods such as cheese that don't seem to be raising cholesterol as one would predict, and we're actually, despite their fat content are actually associated with reduced risk for hard endpoints like heart disease and stroke. Now let's look at dairy as part of a healthy dietary pattern, which is how we always talk about our dairy foods anyway. And, first, let's talk about the DASH study. A lot of people are familiar with DASH, Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It was based on this landmark study back in 1997 from a group at Johns Hopkins. Next slide, please. That looked at basically 3 dietary patterns in an attempt to lower blood pressure. They looked at typical Western diet, so the control diet, and then they looked at a diet that was rich in fruits and vegetables as one condition, and then a third condition, a combined diet of a diet rich in fruits and vegetables as well as low-fat dairy foods. And what they found was that while the diet rich in fruits and vegetables significantly lowered blood pressure, not until they added the low-fat dairy foods to the mix did they get the most significant reduction in blood pressure. So since then, dairy foods have been recommended as a part of DASH. If those of you familiar with the 2015 dietary guidelines are probably familiar with the healthy US style eating pattern, which is very much patterned after the DASH. It's a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, and whole grain, and recommends 3 servings of low-fat and fat-free dairy foods. Next slide, please. But then the question now arises when you're looking at DASH, the recommendation of low-fat and fat-free dairy, and we're looking at this emerging research on fuller fat dairy foods. What would happen if we substituted the low-fat, fat-free dairy foods in DASH with 3 servings of full-fat dairy foods as a part of DASH and kept everything else the same? In order to make room for the calories, we just would reduce the carbohydrate and the sugar content of the DASH diet. This was a question that was proposed by Dr. Ron Krause at the Children's Hospital in Oakland Research Center, and then the National Dairy Council sponsored this randomized controlled trial. So again, as we're looking on this slide here, we're getting higher fat consumption from whole milk dairy foods, and just to make the calories the same, we're just reducing carbohydrate, mainly from fruit juice in the comparison group. So, and the next slide, please. And what we found was, in asking the question, could a modified DASH, including full-fat dairy, improve risk factors for cardiovascular disease and blood pressure? The answer appeared to be yes. Both the conventional DASH, as has been shown before, lowered blood pressure, as well as the high-fat DASH lowered blood pressure, in basically the same magnitude. Cholesterol levels went down slightly in both those groups. HDL went up a little bit in the high-fat dairy group. Triglycerides, another blood lipid factor, no change in the DASH, actually was reduced, so a benefit there in the high-fat DASH, and then the total HDL cholesterol ratio was reduced in the high-fat DASH. So take-home message here is that the primary goal of the DASH diet, Dietary Approaches to Reduce Hypertension, is to reduce blood pressure. Both a low-fat, fat-free dairy DASH as well as a high-fat dairy DASH can accomplish that goal. And in fact, when you reduce the carbohydrate a little bit, you see some actual favorable responses that you don't in the high-fat DASH that you didn't see in the DASH when it comes to triglycerides. But the bottom line is all dairy foods, regardless of fat content, can fit into a healthy eating pattern such as DASH. Next slide, please. So that was just a sampling of some of the research. We could probably spend an entire semester on some of the going and diving into some of the all the research. But I think some of those are just a good example of the things that we've been seeing, particularly in the last 6-7 years. It's been really happening fast. Now let's look at where the recommendations are from authoritative bodies. This first one I want to share with you. This is the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation. And the best way to describe this organization, it's sort of like the Canadian American Heart Association. And they came out with their recommendations. This is now looking at 2015, so a couple years ago now. And this is really one of the first authoritative bodies that, that based on the research that shows sort of no association with saturated fat, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just sort of neutral, they didn't have a limit on saturated fat in their guidelines. So basically removed the saturated fat limitation and instead just focused on diet quality. Fruits, vegetables, dairy foods, whole grains, things of that nature. And quoting here, there's emerging evidence to suggest that the health effects of saturated fats could vary depending on the food source in which they are found. So therefore, speaking to the research, part of the research I already presented, depending on the food source, it might different. So might be different. So let's focus on diet quality instead of looking at that saturated fat number. So really an interesting position here by the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation. Next slide, please. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics in their 2014 position on fats and fatty acids, also acknowledging that perhaps a single fatty acid, focusing on a single fatty acid is a little bit too simplistic. The quote here, fatty acids are consumed as parts of foods that contain other nutrients and other dietary compounds. These have both an additive and synergistic effects on health and interact in complex ways that are difficult to delineate. I think that's a really nice summary of the state of the science. We're still learning how these nutrients within a package of a food, a package, interact with each other, and there's really no more complex package than that of dairy foods, with the multitude of nutrients and the structure of how the fatty acids are delivered. So really the Academy here acknowledging that it might just be, it's not as simple as just that one fatty acid or fatty acid class. Next slide, please. And then more recently, the Joslin Diabetes Center, which is one of the leading diabetes centers in the world, they released their own dietary guidelines, and they had a lot of interesting things to say about dairy. First of all, what I'm not getting into here in this webinar, maybe a topic for a future webinar, is there seems to be some, also evidence linking dairy food consumption to reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. And that's acknowledged here in the Joslin recommendations. But also recent evidence demonstrates that saturated fat from dairy foods, milk, cheese, and yogurt may be acceptable within total caloric intakes. So again, acknowledging that perhaps it's more about the food itself than necessarily, or providing that flexibility of whichever dairy you might choose, more about consuming the dairy foods as opposed to focusing necessarily on whether it's low fat, fat free, or full fat dairy foods. Next slide, please. And then lastly here, the dietary guidelines for Americans in 2015, where there is that 10% limit on saturated fat still. And that was based largely on following the American Heart Association recommendations as well. But I thought this quote was very interesting. This quote here in the green: healthy eating patterns can accommodate nutrient-dense foods with small amounts of saturated fats, as long as calories from saturated fats do not exceed the 10%, and total fats remain in the AMDR. So really, I think the message here from the dietary guidelines, and I think a very good one, is wherever you're going to consume your saturated fat, make it a nutrient-dense food. So if that means that dairy foods are obviously nutrient-dense, and so if you want to get your dairy servings with a full-fat piece of cheese, and you still stay within those recommendations, and that's the way you should do it, focusing on nutrient-dense sources of some of these saturated fats. Next slide, please. So just to round out my presentation, I wanted to call attention to something on the nationaldairycouncil.org website. There's a lot of different resources for you to look at, a lot of blog posts on timely scientific topics. Sometimes when new research comes out, we try to put a blog up to interpret it and tell what it means from our perspective. But you'll also see some science summaries and science briefs. And this science brief on whole and reduced fat dairy foods is one you can find. And this is a very detailed literature review on where the science stands on whole and reduced fat dairy foods and how they fit into a healthy dietary pattern. A lot of the research I've mentioned here today you will find in that science brief, as well as, again, there's other research as well that we don't necessarily have time to go into today that provides a little more detail on a lot of the role of whole and reduced fat dairy foods in healthy dietary patterns as relates to cardiovascular disease related outcomes and type 2 diabetes related outcomes. So I would encourage you to seek out that review, and hopefully that can and answer some more of your questions if you have some. And I think that might be my last slide. Oh, so one last slide for me, summary points before I turn it over to Madeline. So if I can summarize my presentation today, I would say the latest evidence for population studies and meta-analyses is that saturated fat consumption is not associated with cardiovascular disease risk. It's mainly neutral. Dairy fat has shown both neutral and beneficial associations with cardiovascular risk. Is really interesting emerging research. Cheese consumption does not appear to impact cholesterol levels, and cheese actually has actually shown to reduce cardiovascular disease risk. Dietary guidelines U.S. dietary guidelines continue to limit saturated fat, recommend low-fat and fat-free dairy foods, but some authoritative bodies have begun to evolve their recommendations to, I would say, de-emphasize saturated fat and recognize that not all food sources of saturated fat are necessarily equal. And I think that is the end of my presentation, and I will turn it over to Madeline, and she will give you an idea of what we're seeing in the consumer landscape.
Great, thanks, Mickey. So what I'd like to start out with is just a little bit of what's happening with the consumer mindset on dairy. And we'll also take a peek at what's happening with regards to new product launches. And finally, we'll look at what sales have been within this category. Next slide, please. So one thing that we have found is that food shopping has really changed over time. The part that maybe remains a little bit constant is that people are buying food and preparing that food is really an expression of care for their family, for friends that come over. They're trying to nurture those relationships. But what we're finding is that there's some change that's occurring in terms of how people are determining the value of that food that they're buying today. We know that consumers are looking for simple ingredients. They don't want anything that's unnecessary in their food. They don't want anything that's viewed as being unnecessary in terms of stages of cooking or preserving or the way that it was grown. They don't want unnecessary chemicals in that food as well. And what we find is that millennials in particular are shopping differently. So the way that they're defining value is much more than perhaps price has been in the past. And many of these attributes that we're going to be talking about today are just clearly much more important in that purchase decision for that younger consumer. So consumers are really idealizing food that's as close to nature as possible. They're looking for things that are less processed, things that have not undergone any kind of substantial change, perhaps since the farm. So what we're looking at here in this chart is that it's showing how consumers are embracing approaches to healthy eating that are taking into account a number of different attributes. So as we see defining definitions of better food, it's really real food, fresh food that's viewed as being minimally processed, beverages as well. You can see from this list here that clearly the benefit in terms of good for the heart still remains at the very top of this list, as Americans really do recognize heart disease as being something critical, and that they know of consumers and friends who have suffered from that, so they're very much on their radar. But what we also see on this list are many of the things that I talked about. So people looking for things that are minimally processed, people looking for things that have the shortest list of ingredients. The whole idea of local foods is an important point, because people can view that as being something that is maybe a better for you food, not necessarily something that they're always purchasing, but something still that they're really inspired to buy on a long period of time. Next slide, please. We also know that there are certain foods that consumers are adding to their diet. In the top of this list, we see many things that relate to satiety. So consumers who are looking to add fiber and protein and healthy fats to their diet to help keep them full. Also try to provide them maybe a sense of sustained energy throughout that day as well. You see nuts and seeds on this list being viewed as better for you snacks. We also see that many of dairy's nutrients are very well represented on this list. So protein is very high up, vitamin D and calcium. So again, what dairy brings to the party, very well positioned in terms of what consumers want to add to their diet. We also see the emphasis on healthy fats is here as well. And about 39% of consumers are mentioning that they're trying to add that to their diet. Next slide, please. So we know that consumers view natural as being something that's better for that food. And there's many different ways that they're motivated in terms of that. I would say that the most motivating belief is that natural in their mind is supporting a healthier, a higher quality life. They're looking for those natural foods to gain more in their diet. We also know that consumers are learning about the link between on-farm practices and the surrounding environment. So more natural farming is believed to create healthier and more balanced systems, which again are better for them as well as better for the planet overall. And finally, we know that consumers today are just much more skeptical than they have been before. They're skeptical of government, they're skeptical of big business, big ag, et cetera. And they feel that that big industry out there really does not have their personal needs as a priority, that they may be more so focused on the financial end of this. So there's a sense that natural foods are less likely perhaps to have been changed for the worse as a route maybe to profit, and thus from their own perspective, again, doing less harm. Next slide, please. So we mentioned that consumers are interested in adding higher quality fats in their diet. The slide that we're looking at here has a variety of different pictures on here. These would be viewed as artifacts that in consumer interviews we find consumers kind of playing back that they view these as healthier alternatives to other foods that are out there. And these healthier fats bring a number of different benefits. We know that, one of those benefits obviously is just the pure enjoyment. So people looking for permission for something that they find is very pleasurable to consume. We also know there's a lot of experimentation out there with regards to flavors, new flavors, things that might fill you up a little bit more, along with wellness. And as you look at the pictures here, you can see there's a number of different oils. So walnut oil, coconut oil, olive oil are all represented, some of them being good sources of omega-3 fatty acids, others, boasting perhaps some benefits relating to the immune system, arthritis, many having mono unsaturated fatty acids in them. Hummus is in here, so again, looking for protein. We saw that at the top of one of our lists as well. And then you also note that butter and whole fat yogurt are represented here as well. So consumers kind of recognizing that many of these foods, if they add more to their diet, this would be a positive in terms of overall healthful living. Next slide, please. Yet we also know that there's certain things that consumers are trying to avoid in their diet. So just as we saw the top 20 additions to the diet, these would be those that are kind of on that bottom end. And what we find at the top of this list is sodium. So sodium is something that's still heavily avoided. Again, consumers do connect that with heart health. We also see that much of what's on this list, consumers are kind of linking to indicators of perhaps more processed foods, which again, they view as kind of being the evil villain there. Other red flags that we see here, high fructose corn syrup. We see high fat levels represented here. We also see a lot of artificial ingredients. And finally, there's kind of a common theme of sugars that are out there today. So consumers recognizing that sugar perhaps is even a little bit more harmful to their diet in some indications than perhaps fat has been in the past. Next slide, please. So as we start to look at kind of new product launches, the data that we have here is through it's a global database called ANOVA. We're looking specifically at just what's happening in the United States, and we've just taken kind of a look at whole milk as an ingredient. So looking at dairy products overall, and which of those, are kind of touting that whole milk piece of it. And as you can see here, it's been growing quite nicely through 2015 and 16. Right now, we have data through September of 2017. If that launch kind of continues for the rest of the year, will again be pretty much comparable to where we've been for the last couple of years. So a lot of excitement in the sense of new products that are being launched. Next slide. So let's take a look at maybe just a couple of highlights or examples of each of those. So some of the recent whole fat product introductions in kind of the milk category focus around a few different points. And I've highlighted kind of in blue here what I feel is really connecting to what consumers view as perhaps some of the particular benefits of the whole milk piece of this. So for example, we have Strauss. It's a chocolate, it's organic, it's a whole milk out there. And in their description and their communications to consumers, they're really positioning this as milk's natural fat, providing satiety. It's a healthier treat option. So again, trying to kind of focus on maybe the whole package. It has less sugar as well in this product. It only has 5 ingredients in that. It's much more natural for that consumers. It's something that you can feel good about serving to your family overall. Another example here comes from Maple Hill Creamery, which is from just one farm in New York. So again, it's trying to kind of offer consumers that ability to kind of trace this product back just to one farm. It's a farm where they talk about, grass-fed, pastured cows. But the language I think that's particularly important here is that it talks about straight from the source. So again, it's that whole idea that anytime you can get as close to nature as possible, consumers are viewing that as something much more positive in terms of something that they want to consume in their diet. Next slide, please. A couple of additional milk ones. We have A2 has come out now with the whole milk. They had other fat levels in the past. I think the important thing here is that they are focusing on the fact that this is a full-bodied milk suitable for the whole family. So again, this idea that perhaps it's offering you a better flavor profile than maybe some of the lower fat products that are out there. Also, I think it kind of raising the idea that it's a product that maybe is much more filling to you as well. Certainly, again, many of these new products are trying to create kind of a whole package of positioning to that consumers by telling their particular story. Part of that A2 milk story is all based on animal care, and they have very strict guidelines, and they're just kind of reminding consumers that they can feel good about the product that they're buying for their family. The new Seasons organic whole milk, again, a product in the U.S. that's coming to us from the Pacific Northwest. Here, they're really referring much more so to kind of the taste of the product. So it's bringing you much fresher and creamier taste experience than perhaps a lower fat products. So again, something that is appealing to many consumers out there who've moved away perhaps from a product they really cherished in terms of taste, just to give up some of the fat in the past. So again, moving on to the next slide, a couple of the introductions that we've seen in the yogurt category. One is from Trader's Point Creamery. This is a product that is presented to the consumer in a glass jar, so it's got a very nice presentation to it. Again, it's kind of reminding the consumer it's very minimally processed. Again, grass-fed, whole milk, and presenting kind of that full picture to that consumer, not homogenized, tying it back to kind of the more natural state. And the brown cow whole milk yogurt here is talking about it's made from a whole milk that's sweetened with cane sugar. So trying again to get to the more natural, what they're viewing from a consumer perspective is the more natural form of sugar and maple syrup. Again, kind of a pure product here. Kind of talks a little bit about how, what their farmers are pledging in terms of hormone use, et the package being recyclable. So making you try to feel good about the product that you're buying here today. Next slide. A couple of additional products. The first one is a drinkable yogurt. This product is really talking about the simple ingredients, only 5 ingredients that go into this product. It's an Icelandic style yogurt, which means that it's a thicker, creamier product. It has high protein, less sweet, but it's made here in New York. It takes 4 times as much milk to make this yogurt than some of the other ones, so a good thing from a farmer perspective. And again, no artificial anything within that product. And then what we see is this Ronnybrook cinnamon butter. And they have kind of an interesting look or take on butter that I've not seen before. And they're really talking about kind of nutrients in butter. And they talk about how it protects us from heart disease and cancer. It's the first one that I've seen that's actually come out and talked a little bit about that. It's interesting to kind of go to their website because they really go on and on about vitamin E and selenium and vitamin A, all found in butter, antioxidants, etc. But as we kind of look at maybe the fat part of this in general, what we note also is that you talk about a higher butter fat content and how they're made in maybe smaller batches, and also kind of the chef experience and that it's a creamier product. So again, trying to present themselves and maybe differentiate themselves a little bit from some of the other products out there. I think it's just kind of an interesting twist on what we've seen in the past. Next slide, please. This next product is also a butter product. And what they look at here is trying to talk to the point that this is maybe reminiscent of old European type butters. So fuller flavor, higher fat level, a lot of care that's gone into this product in terms of churning. One thing I think that's quite interesting is how they say that this product really is a partnership, and it's a partnership between the land, the cows, the family farms, and you. So trying to be kind of like one, that whole holistic experience. Again, just maybe a new positioning for a product of this nature. So with that, that's just giving you a little bit of a take on what some of the new launches are that are really trying to capitalize or leverage this whole fat trend that's out there today. Let's take a peek at what the sales are actually doing. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, this slide, whole milk. So what we see is whole milk over time, and we're looking at 5-6 years here. We see consistent growth within the category. And we noted that this category, or this segment, I should say, of the milk category has been growing for quite some time. But as you note, in 2013 and 14, we saw very small increases that really were kicked into gear in 2015 and 16, and even the most recent year. Whether or not that's directly related to the science that's out there, or whether consumers are also capitalizing perhaps on some of the trends that have been in place, we can't say for sure, but we do know that there's a lot of interest in this product. And right now, whole fat is holding about 36% share of the category. It's just slightly under what we see for 2% of milk. And I would guess that probably in the next year, we're going to see an advance for whole milk being the largest segment of the category. If we look at how many whole milk items are in each store, it's about 31 right now, and we see that growing as well. So the number of offerings certainly are growing. Next slide, please. So now let's take a look at whole fat yogurt. This has been maybe kind of a smaller segment of the category. Right now it holds about 14% share, but that has doubled in just 5 or so years. So this is really coming on quite strongly. And the number of whole milk yogurt items per store is nearly 80, and that has much more than doubled. So we're seeing a lot of interest in this particular product. Again, as you look at that growth numbers, we're not only in double digits, but we're approaching 20 to 30% growth each year in this particular segment. So certainly a lot of interest here. And as we look at the types of households that are growing, interesting thing for both milk and yogurt is you really see volume growth across pretty much any type of household. So in other words, look at it by income, look at it by age or generation, look at it by race or ethnicity. All of them are growing. And what we do know for whole fat yogurt is that there are some skews that are occurring. In other words, this particular product tends to skew a little bit higher for higher per capita income. We also know that households that have children in them, or younger households, tend to embrace this product a little bit more so, as well as Asian and Hispanic households. So we are seeing some good growth everywhere, but in particular, there are certain areas of strength that we notice. And finally, let's turn to the next slide here and take a peek at cheese. And for this, I'm looking at natural cheese, and this would be regular fat cheese. And one thing that's clear is that most cheese is at the higher fat level. That's almost 80% of the overall category. And cheese has really been a growth driver overall for dairy, and certainly natural cheese has been the one to promote all of that growth that we've been looking at. So we've been seeing some nice growth rates. You can see along the bottom here. In 2016 and 15, we were up about 5%, a little bit slower this year, about 2% increase. A lot of cheese offerings in the store at over 400. Again, we expect to post continuous growth within this category. And as with many of the other ones, we're seeing growth across nearly all types of households. We see strongest growth occurring amongst kids households or millennial households, which would have those children in there. So that's, I think, encouraging because, again, they're kind of starting some of those food shopping habits and preparation habits that will take them into later years as well. So with that, let's take a look at some of the key takeaways here. I think we've seen that consumers are very much motivated today to live healthy. And in that respect, they're trying to look after not only their own personal health, but that of their family as well. And they know that even though maybe healthy living is a very holistic definition, food is really at the center of it. So consumers today are aspiring to try to consume more natural food. We know that for many consumers, whole fat is really leveraging this trend today. We also know that many of the benefits that have come along with that whole fat are important to consumers. So we saw, for example, that as milk is growing amongst many different demographics, we know that maybe there's different motivations behind that. For an older consumer, perhaps it's taking them back to a product that they grew up with. For a younger consumer, and maybe it's a product they feel is the best for their child, a young child in that household. But we also know that it's providing not only taste, but satiety as well. And even though we see a lot of growth within kind of that whole fat segment, you know, I think we have to be aware of the fact that not everyone is on this trend at this point in time. We still see saturated fat for many consumers to be a watch out. We still see a lot of consumers, you know, who have not had maybe exposure to anything in terms of this research. But certainly, I think the track that we're on is a very positive path with certainly growth continuous for the next couple of years. And with that, I'll turn it back to Trish.
Awesome. Well, thanks to both of you. Really a great kind of crash course on the emerging research and sort of the impact on consumer and product trends, and then the overall impact on sales. So before we open it up to questions, I just wanted to draw your attention to one new research and reiterate or repeat the science brief that Mickey shared earlier. You know, if you're interested in really kind of keeping on top of the latest information around emerging research around dairy fat, or if you're looking for some really consumer-oriented responses to some of the questions that consumers are asking about dairy fat, I want to point you to dairygood.org, which is hopefully a website that most of you have visited, but this is DMI's website that really does a great job in posting some of the latest updates around research and some of the kind of consumer-focused information that answers some of the questions that consumers are frequently asking, or some of the frustrations that we're hearing in the industry about dairy fat. So I encourage you to visit dairygood.org. And then this is another look, again, just that science brief that Mickey talked about. We will send a link to this brief out in our thank you follow-up email. So for those of you who are interested in learning more and digging in deeper into that brief, a link for that will be coming your way. So we've got a few minutes here, as I mentioned at the end, for some questions. If you have a question you'd like to have Madeline or Mickey answer, just feel free to type it in the chat box on your computer screen here, and then Sarah Miller from our team will help direct the question to one of our speakers. As you're doing that, we've already gotten an early question into the mix, so I'll start off the Q&A by repeating. Mickey, there's a question about, is there a difference in the type of saturated fat that isn't associated with cardiovascular disease risk?
So I'll go back to that one slide earlier in my presentation. I said the one where it was really the first to show dairy fat was associated with reduced risk for cardiovascular disease. And in that same paper, they did report that when they combined all saturated fat from meat sources, they did show an increased risk. So it seems that whether it's the specific fatty acids found in dairy versus other foods, or the other nutrients that are coming along in dairy for the ride, I would say the research isn't necessarily that far along yet to know the answer. But I do think that there certainly does seem to be something differentiating dairy foods and dairy fat. I think we have more research to go to understand what exactly those things are. But I think I think where I would speculate is that it's the nutrient package as well as the unique fatty acid profile. Which fatty acids specifically, I think, is where the question's going at. And there is some indication that there are some unique fatty acids in dairy that are having a favorable effect, some with regard to diabetes specifically, and others with cardiovascular disease. But I'd say that's research is still emerging. If I maybe had more time, I could take a deeper dive into that area. But that is still emerging.
Great, thanks. We have a second question for Madeline, and I'm not sure if this is one you'll be able to. Do you feel that some of the products with heavy labeling on some of those trendy claims are partly there for financial gain to appeal to consumers and not just promoting something that's truly beneficial?
Well, I think what the products are trying to do is promote themselves as being as natural as possible. I think, you know, there certainly are two sides to what is really natural, but from a consumer perspective, they're trying to talk about maybe the fewer ingredients, the less processing. They're trying to tie it to the farm as much as possible and suggest kind of purity on that farm as well. So certainly there are other ways that you can kind of depict a natural product, but I think that's what the intent of some of those products are.
Great. And then for Mickey, this is, do you have some recommendations or quick talking points for folks who want to explain to the public or perhaps their clients or customers that the saturated fat in meat is bad, but the fat in dairy is fine, or there's emerging research showing that there are some neutral or health benefits there?
Yeah, so I think what I usually tend to focus on is number one, the uniqueness of how dairy fat is packaged. There is, you know, when it comes to something like cheese or even milk and yogurt, there's a uniqueness to how that fat is delivered that you don't see in other foods. And perhaps that is in part what explains the health effects of those foods. Secondly, I usually would say that in dairy foods, you're getting a nutrient package that you don't see in other foods, whether it's the calcium and vitamin D or potassium, all having or others, all having their own unique impact on health, that regardless of the fat content, that you're getting all of that along for the ride as well. So I would say that, you know, I'll always focus on the unique. Whenever I'm asked that question, I always focus on the uniqueness of dairy foods, both in the way the fat is delivered and then the nutrients that come along with it that you don't necessarily see in other foods.
Got it. And then how do you explain where the saturated fats and tropical oils fit in? So palm and coconut oil.
Good question. In that same study, they looked at that actually. They tried to figure out, and I didn't show those data, they tried to determine a relationship with saturated fat from, they termed plant sources, which is basically coconut oil sources. And consumption wasn't high enough to determine any relationship. So when there's really small consumption, you can't really determine what's going on at all. So so unfortunately, the response there is that we don't really know. There's just not a lot of research on those tropical oils and the effects on cardiovascular disease. The way there is just such a large research body on dairy foods and just dairy foods in general, not just the fat, on health outcomes. So I would say that, you know, the tropical oils might be an interesting theory, but we just don't have a lot of research there to back it up.
Got it. And then another one for you, Mickey, on the kind of slide on cardiovascular disease and the modified DASH diets.
Yes.
And with regard to the reduction in cardiovascular risk and high-fat cheese and decreased triglycerides, were other macronutrients decreased, or were there other? Okay.
Yeah. So in that high-fat DASH diet, in order to make a comparison, equal comparison in terms of calories, they took the low-fat DASH, which has about roughly 40% of the fruit in regular low-fat DASH comes from fruit juice, and so they just removed the fruit juice from the diet plan, and that made room for the calories, the additional calories from the dairy servings that they had because they were going with a full-fat 3 servings of full-fat dairy foods. So therefore, they were equal in calories. One was higher in fat and lower in carbohydrate, and then one was higher in carbohydrate and lower in fat. And that turned out to be, a favorable change because it's really that carbohydrate content that seems to affect the triglycerides the most. And so when they removed the carbohydrate and replaced it with fat, they showed a benefit with the triglycerides. But remember, it didn't seem to matter in blood pressure. Either way, whether you were on low-fat DASH or high-fat DASH, which the purpose of DASH is to lower blood pressure, both lower blood pressure significantly.
Okay, great. So we got a couple minutes. Any last minute questions coming in, Sarah? I think we might be wrapping it up.
We just had one more. It says, I'm a dietitian and I'm having a hard time recommending whole dairy when so many people have an issue with too much added sugar in their diet as well. How do you suggest incorporating this recommendation for the general public?
For me, it's not necessarily about recommending 3 servings of full-fat dairy that you saw in that DASH study, but it is more about flexibility. What we're seeing in this research, if somebody prefers, if they prefer 2% milk versus not drinking their milk at all, or if that serving of full-fat cheese with their glass of wine is really what makes their day, that figure out a way to get that into their diet plan. I think that's what I would. That's if I was. I'm not a dietitian, and I'm not. I don't counsel patients. But if I was to approach it in that way, of flexibility, understanding what's most important to them, and in order to achieve their 3 servings that are recommended, then that's how I would approach it. It wouldn't necessarily be, oh, everybody goes on 3 servings of full fat now, but more about meeting somebody where they are.
Great. Well, as we close, I know we're getting up to the top of the hour. I really want to thank Mickey and Madeline again for sharing your expertise, really valuable information on this topic that I know we're all very interested in, and hearing a lot of conversation and seeing a lot of action in the dairy case. So really appreciate your perspectives. And I wanted to thank everyone on the line here as well for being participants in the webinar. We encourage you to take what you learned today and share it with your family and friends, your customers, your clients who are really, again, engaging in these conversations about full-fat dairy in the diet. Again, Midwest Dairy, the National Dairy Council, Dairy Management Inc., we're all here to provide resources and assistance. So if you have any questions or need additional details, just connect in with your program manager at Midwest Dairy, and we'll get you to the right folks to get your questions answered. And so to follow up, just for those of you who have been part of our webinars in the past, we'll be sending a follow-up email that'll have a link to this presentation with the slides and a recording. We'll also include that link to the science brief that Mickey talked about. There'll be information for registered dietitians about how to log on for your continuing education credits, and again, an email for ongoing communication if you have additional questions. Know that besides receiving the link to the webinar, we do post all of our webinars on Midwest Dairy's website, so midwestdairy.com, and there's a Dairy Resource Center tab in the upper right hand. So if you can find this webinar posted there, that'll probably happen tomorrow, but all the other webinars that we've hosted over the last couple of years are there as well. So again, as we move to 2 o'clock, thanks to Mickey and Madeline for your expertise, and thanks to all of you on the phone for participating in our 4th webinar this year. We really appreciate your support and wish you a wonderful holiday season. Thanks so much.